first place, and what it tells us about Dominic Cummings. Dominic Cummings is the Marxist of Downing Street who wants to weaken institutions like the civil service, so says Rachel Sylvester in The Times. EU leaders are clowns in Blower's cartoon in The Telegraph. Michel Barnier juggling money, fish and tariffs. Meanwhile, The Sun's editorial warns the Prime Minister he's in danger of misjudging the public moods by failing to visit areas hit by flooding caused at this time by Storm Dennis. Back to The Telegraph, Jamie Blackett says politicians and senior civil servants shouldn't be so defeatist blaming climate change. They should instead do more to protect people's homes. Polly Hudson describes the blame game following the death of Caroline Flack as futile, saying it's a parable for our times, which says as much about us as it does about her. In The Guardian, Polly Toynbee says Sir Keir Starmer has what it takes to be Labour leader. Some remain unconvinced. Well, with me today to look through all of those, the writer Benedict Spetz and Rachel Cunliffe, comment editor at the newspaper City AM. Lovely to see you both this morning, and no prizes for guessing where we will start. And actually, the the Times cartoon of Dominic Cummings is a decent picture to have on screen as we discuss the inevitable departure of Andrew Sabisky. I mean, it was inevitable, wasn't it?
I think it was inevitable when you looked at some of the comments that allegedly he had made. It didn't have to be a story, though. What has surprised me most about this whole debacle is that the crisis response from Downing Street has been so ill-judged and inadequate. I mean, the Prime Minister was asked yesterday, would he condemn the views? And they sort of a non-comment, or you can see he's written extensively on the subject, his views are well documented. Well, that just leaves it very much open to interpretation. Downing Street could have made this just go away instantly by saying, we didn't know that these views, we weren't aware of this, we categorically condemned them, and we're dealing with the situation. Instead, they've turned it into yet another scandal.
I mean, just to reference that lobby meeting, that I read a transcript of it yesterday, which I'm going to read out. If we can't find a reference to the PM's views on eugenics, what inference can we draw from that? The PM's views are well documented. They're not. As I've said, the PM's views are well documented. None of us know what they are. Could you just tell us? As I've said, I've answered this several times now. Now, clearly, someone somewhere in number 10, Benedict, said, this is the strategy today. The strategy is to stonewall.
Yeah, I think Rachel's right. The handling of it is the strangest element of it from number 10, but that, I think, gives you the impression of an administration with Mr. Cummings at the heart of it that, as we've already seen, doesn't want to play by the normal set of rules. And I think the appointment of Mr. Sabisky in the first place proves that actually they're trying to be a bit different. We all remember the advert that was put out on his blog about people who, aren't conformists, they think a different way. Mr. Sabisky certainly ticks a lot of those boxes. What I do find very interesting, of course, is that a lot of this was just out there in the public domain and that nobody had thought to check. And, maybe this might not be the best person to have in number 10 and not have a clear vetting process. But I am also more interested in perhaps the way in which it's come out. I mean, it must be said, a lot of the things that Mr. Sabisky has said on IQ, for example, are, you'd say, troubling, to say the least. But to put them in context, they were said an awful long time ago, before he was anywhere near any sort of position of authority. So I think the opportunity to perhaps explain himself might have been welcome. Other things that he said, for example, on women's sports, were taken wildly out of context, and these were in fact the first things that the press led with. And the thing that you have to ask yourself is, well, why is it that we've gone in this direction? Why is it that a man has been selectively quoted here or there to try to find something to pin on him, and eventually something was found to pin on him? And I do think it's very curious that this comes...
It was quite something to pin on him, a defence of eugenics.
Absolutely. But this, I think, is more the question is why it is that they've gone after this person who nobody had heard of before now. And that is because the man at the heart of this, Dominic Cummings, is essentially untouchable.
Well, let's talk about Dominic Cummings and Rachel Sylvester's line piece, which I needed a bit of explanation for, frankly, that Dom is the Marxist of Downing Street.
So she is, there's sort of a theory in Marxist thought that what you need to do is control the institutions. There's this line, the long march through the institutions, it's a slogan of a Marxist activist, and that's basically what he's doing. He's attacking the institutions, whether that's the media or the courts or the civil service or the political establishment. We know he's all about creative destruction, tearing everything down. But the point that Rachel Sylvester is making is that that's not a particularly conservative strategy, and it's not a particularly democratic one either, because what he's trying to do is centralise power, because he believes that the institutions which are there to hold the government to account are too liberal, and so he's driving a bulldozer through them. I just want to put the kind of hiring and the scandal and the eugenics comments just back to Dominic Cummings. That advert about misfits and weirdos was all about diversity of thought, getting diversity of thought into Downing Street.
No one has issues with that.
No one has issues with that. But who did he hire? Someone who actually looks quite a lot like him, who was a fan of his website.
He wrote on it.
Exactly. Dominic Cummings says he wants to bring people in with expertise in science and data. All of the science and all of the data shows that those views that he holds, they are not scientifically sound. So he's actually just as hypocritical as the people who he's been condemning, the blob of institutions.
This is more the direction that I wanted to go in, rather than go down a path of trying to defend everything in his comments. But the point is, actually, this is somebody who was known to Mr. Cummings. You know, even if he was going through the vetting process, he would have found these comments on his website. And I think it's very interesting because the press is trying to go after Mr. Cummings, as we've seen by quite how much coverage there is of him. But he is essentially untouchable at the moment, especially in the wake of the last reshuffle, where it was, is it going to be the Chancellor or the Chief Advisor? Well, it's very much the Chief Advisor who's won out. He is the one that has just sacked an awful lot of spats, a lot of advisors. He's moved around an awful lot of ministers. That's an awful lot of people within the sort of the setup of Westminster and Whitehall who are now, the landscape has been very much changed. And he has also gone after the media. We've seen that with the press briefings. We've seen that with the BBC. So if you're the press and you're trying to come back at this person, which, to be honest, why should we expect anything differently when this man has declared war on the media, but you can't go after him? Who do you go for? Well, you go for the people around him. You go for the support structures. And I almost think, given how easy it would have been to research his views, and given that he was known to him, might this not have been some sort of a sacrificial lamb?
Do you honestly think he's perfectly insulated? We had Kwasi Kwarteng on this morning, essentially, I think, firing a shot across Dominic Cummings' bows, pointing out that he read this stuff, felt it was racist, reprehensible, wondered why Number 10 was having anything to do with him. I mean, he's pointing a finger of blame, isn't he?
He is, and he's not the only one. Quite a few Conservative MPs have come out about this issue. Other Conservative MPs have come out about the war on the BBC, which we know is another Dominic Cummings project. I think there is real anger and a sense of being disturbed and concerned within the Conservative Party about who is this man who, let's not forget, is not a Conservative. How does he have so much power, and how is he sort of restricting the power of the parliamentary party that is meant to have that kind of equal relationship with the Prime Minister? So you're going to see that anger growing, I think.
Briefly.
Well, that's exactly what I was getting at, is essentially that you have these people, Dominic Cummings is unelected, he's very controversial, but for as many Dominic Cummings as there are, every time you have an Andrew Sabisky case, it is a sacrificial lamb. It's somebody you can put in the firing line, and that insulates him a little bit better, because although it does lead to criticism of him, it's not him directly that has to take the fall for it.
Guys, we will have to leave it here. We'll see you next hour, where I promise we will discuss another story, okay? We'll see you shortly. But for the rest of you, coming up next, his continued attention. More on that throughout the day here. But let's return to The View. Benedict and Rachel still here. And let's turn our attention to that cartoon in The Telegraph this morning. Strange that The Telegraph has chosen to portray certain key European figures as clowns this morning. But the reason we're using this is, of course, we were hearing last night from David Frost, our man who's going to be negotiating the trade agreement. And it does feel that we have a little bit more clarity as to what's going to come next.
Yeah, it's very rare, actually, that David Frost sort of makes such a public appearance. But he was very clear about what Britain is going to ask for in these negotiations, because obviously Brexit has been done, but the process is far from over. Some very hard language about not agreeing to the EU's requirements on level playing field rules. Basically, the point he was making, and I actually think he's right on this, is that this isn't a bargaining chip in the negotiations. The whole point of Brexit was that Britain would be in control of our rules, and he's finally outlining that if that means no trade deal, we will take the consequences of that. It's not something that we can be out of the EU and then let the EU continue to set the rules. And that language, that explicit requirement, I think is what's unusual here.
Benedict, just pause for a second. Sorry to keep interrupting your flow, but just a little bit of breaking news, and more of which we'll bring you throughout the day. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, we're told via the Press Association, Boris Johnson and his estranged wife, Marina Wheeler, have reached an agreement relating to money following their separation 2 years ago. This detail emerging at a hearing of the Family Court in London this morning. More on that a little bit later. Benedict, no, back to you.
There's an awful lot going on today.
Julian Assange, the Prime Minister, the Family Courts. Your view on what we heard.
It's a good thing I don't have to comment on those things either.
Thank
Maybe
goodness.
Rachel is, of course, right, as with many things, but I think the thing with this is, as you say, we don't often hear from Mr. Frost, but him coming out and saying these things that I think a lot of people have suspected for a long time, but it does now, certainly in the media sort of say it, put the ball very much firmly in the EU's court. They're the ones that have been saying, it's going to be very difficult, we won't budge on these things, this, that, and the other. And now for the UK to come out and say, actually, pretty straightforward things, and say, well, we wouldn't accept this if you were asking it of us, so why would we accept it? Funnily enough, I actually think it makes the prospect of a no deal in terms of a trade agreement
We don't
more
say
likely.
no deal, we say Australian deal now.
Of
Which
some
means no
sort
deal.
of Southern Hemisphere-based arrangement. It makes that a lot more likely, I suspect, because, as I say, the ball is now in the EU's court, and it is up to them to decide which of their red lines actually are they going to have to trample on, because otherwise we're not going to come together on these issues. I think that's the key thing to take away from this, that probably that eventuality is now a little bit more likely.
Let's have a look at the editorial in The Sun. They've been warning the Prime Minister he's in danger of misjudging the mood. I remember the last time that the Prime Minister got his wellies on, and the public mood, the public weren't very pleased to see it.
Well, he was mopping up a Specsavers, was it? In ankle deep, knee deep in water there. I think the difference, though, in the government's response, particularly the Prime Minister's response, the floods this time round, post-election as opposed to pre-election, we've barely heard anything from him. We had a minister yesterday basically said that he thought the flood defences were okay. This is not the reality for thousands of people in the very parts of the country that won him the election. And obviously, what can he do? Get his wellies on and a mop out? He's not actually going to help. But the idea that he's there and that he cares is very important.
I mean, that's the broader political point, isn't it, Benedict? It's all about shoring up the votes.
It is, but actually I don't think that him visiting these affected areas does shore up the votes, because it just makes him look useless, which in that situation he is. He physically can't do, and he can't hold back the tide. Ultimately it's a question of planning. And I think, to be fair to him, he's not been Prime Minister all that long in the grand scheme of things. This is a large structural issue that has affected governments over the past few decades that hasn't really been addressed. Everything from the dredging of rivers to flood defences. And it's something that I don't think you can pin on Boris Johnson, and I understand, therefore, why he doesn't feel the need to go down to these areas to take the blame for these things. Obviously, people who are affected by these things want to know that the government is helping, but actually the Prime Minister and his entourage and the press taking photographs, that's not help. That's just a photo opportunity.
Well, you never know. He might still be donning the galoshes. Plenty on his plate, but could be on a train sometime later on today. Who knows? We will find out. Rachel, Benedict, always lovely to see you. Thanks for coming in. But stick with us on All Out Politics.